We will start by a 15 minutes intro on the topic of Global LEI Foundation, LEI and vLEI, to set the scene and explain who we are and how we've been doing in the last 10 years as we celebrate our 10 years anniversary this year. And then we will have a conversation with experts from different domains, payments, trade, securities, and let's say digital asset and blockchain, to see how identity and digital identity is essential or important in their field of expertise, and also what challenges that are still existing in that world of identity. So let's start. Of course, feel free during, this is a workshop/panel presentation. So if you want to ask questions, just raise your hands, and no problem. Either the panelists or myself will address it during this session. So what is the Global Legal Entity Identifier Foundation, your host today, GLEIF? GLEIF was created 10 years ago by the Regulatory Oversight Committee, so by the Financial Stability Board, and is overseen by the Regulatory Oversight Committee. So it's a regulator's tool, right, at the end of the day. It was created at the end after the 2008 crisis where Lehman Brothers collapsed. We all remember those times. And actually, for those who were at Sibos that year, it was during Sibos, and suddenly the entire Lehman Brothers team was left Sibos. It was quite an experience to go through. And Lehman Brothers was not one legal entity. It was hundreds of legal entities all over the world. And this debacle led to regulators realizing and banks realizing that they had a very little view or visibility on the exposure they had to all those legal entities. The decision was made at the time to create a system, a passport system for companies, and that's when GLEIF was created. So the way it has been organized is that we have an regulatory oversight committee, 71 regulators from all over the world, and a board, a private board, a private sector board of 18 independent directors who advise us on the strategy, make sure that the two together, that the GLEIF remains a public good, because we are a non-for-profit Swiss foundation with the objective of providing a public good to the society. So far, in the last 10 years, 2.7 million LEIs have been issued. It might seem small compared to the 250 to 300 million legal entities existing out there, but it actually represents something around 80% of global trade in value. So it's really most of the companies doing cross-border transactions would have an LEI. And you can check yourself if you have an LEI in the room. And if not, it's easy to get one. It's a standard. So it's an ISO standard. It's ISO 17442. It has three parts. The first part is about explaining the identifier itself, and I'll show an example of that later, and the reference data associated with that identifier. The part two is about how do you insert a legal entity identifier into a digital certificate. So we're going into digital identity already here in part two. And part three is the vLEI. It has been voted on this year. So the verifiable LEI, the digital identity and verifiable credential system that we built around on top of LEI, is now part of the standard itself. So what is it? It's, at the end of the day, the best analogy is this one. So we all have a national identity card. If I had tried to get into China on Friday when I arrived with my Belgium ID cards, no way I would be here speaking to you. That's why I have a passport, and that we all using to come in this venue. That's why I have a passport, because this is recognized globally. And this is really what the LEI is all about, but for companies. So the companies having an LEI all have a business registry identity, so a national ID card. And the LEI is kind of their passport to be recognized outside of their borders when they do transactions or when they report to regulator. And the same way as a passport, I can use it for traveling, but I can also use it to onboard in a bank in Belgium, in my home country. I don't need to use my national ID card if I use the passport. It also works domestically. And that's what we've seen the LEI evolving into as well, is that it's no longer used for cross-border activity. It's also more and more used for domestic requirements, be it regulatory reporting, but also payments, for example, in India, as a good example. So that's a bit the timeline of GLEIF. 2008 crisis, Lehman Brothers collapsed. I like the little thing there. And then the G20 decides that we need a system for identifying companies. And it has evolved. It started with OTC derivative transactions because that was where the problem was initially, but it has now evolved to more use cases because companies need to be identified for many processes, be it cross-border payments, supply chain, ESG. And now it's evolving into what I call internet or digital, including the blockchain worlds and so the Web 2 and Web 3 worlds as we speak. So let's look into a few use cases in terms of adoption and starting with payments. So these are examples where the vLEI is used domestically and not necessarily for cross-border activities. The ISO 222 CHAPS implementation requires the vLEI to be used in the UK. The instant payments regulation in Europe is also suggesting the use of vLEI as a way to verify beneficiaries of instant payments. It's way easier to match a name, to match an vLEI against records than to match a name and address, because name and address are not standardized. Identifiers are standardized. SIPS, the China Interbank Payment System, is also using the vLEI to identify the counterparties involved in payments. And the Reserve Bank of India has mandated the vLEI actually for payments exceeding 50 crore. I think it's $5 million US, if I remember the conversion properly. And if there's anybody who know better, please tell me. So you can see that those domestic implementation of vLEI has led to a dramatic increase of the number of vLEIs issued in those countries in a period of 4 years. On the cross-border side, the FSB, of course, our father, if you wish, of GLEIF, is still, of course, very supportive of the vLEI. They published this week, actually, a progress report on cross-border payments, where they re-insist on the need for vLEI adoption and give some suggestions to GLEIF and the ROC and yourself as an industry to look to ensure that the vLEI is implemented in payments as a way to identify a payer-payee or creditor-debtor in the ISO 22 terminology. Of course, this needs to be done in collaboration with industry. PMPG is one example of those industry groups that we will engage with to have that implementation successful over time. BIS as well, and CPMI in particular, is suggesting and pushing market infrastructure to implement the vLEI at domestic level as well. And then FATF, you all familiar with FATF, the Financial Action Task Force, who's looking at anti-money laundering prevention, is also suggesting the vLEI to be used, again, because it's easier to match against an identifier or to screen based on an identifier than it is to screen based on a name and an address field. In the supply chain space, we've been collaborating with ICC DSI, so Digital Standards Initiative, this initiative is about standardizing documents that are involved in trade. And there are quite a few of those documents. And as part of that digitalization of exercise, of course, vLEI plays an important role as how you organize companies involved in supply chain, in trade finance, and so on and so forth. And there have been quite interesting studies on what benefits the vLEI could bring. Here it's 60 billion in efficiency savings in the supply chain world. For the industry, obviously, not. That's an example of the part 2 being applied. So the part 2 of the standards. How do you include an vLEI in a digital certificate? It's a Chinese example where the CFCA, or the China Financial Certification Authority, has been incorporating the vLEI in their e-seals system, meaning that Chinese companies with an vLEI can include it into their e-seals when they use it on digital platforms. ESG, that's a new topic that we've been looking at for the last 2 years or 2-3 years. ESG has its challenges in terms of being able to identify organizations properly, but also a source of data and an authentic source of data for reporting of ESG bits on the bid for the environmental, but also the S and the G. And there have been efforts by UNDP, GLEIF, and MAS, for example, to look at how the LEI can help SMEs with their ESG requirements. And also, again, the FSB and other organizations looking at reusing the LEI at the end of the day, so leveraging the LEI for their own needs. So I just showed you what we've been working on, but what are we going to work on in the next 10 years? So we've evolved considerably, but we still have a lot of room for growth. And regionalization is clearly one of the focus we will have in the coming years, meaning we have extended significantly in Asia Pacific because we had presence in Asia Pacific. We added presence, people in India, in China, in Singapore, and Tokyo. We think it's working, and we will apply the same method in Africa and Latin America, where the number of LEIs are not very high, and where we see a lot of benefits for SMEs in particular to establish trust of their existence and when they do business cross-border. Of course, the same applies to Southeast Asia, where we have a conversation with the ASEAN Secretariat and other instances and other organizations that helps companies in those regions. LEI as an innovation at the bottom, it's about finding new use cases and understanding those use cases. So we are very conscious of the fact that an LEI is only an identifier, and that's you can't do anything with just an identifier. It's part of a bigger process. It's part of a bigger problem. So we know that we are only a small piece of the puzzle, a very important one. But in order for these to be successful, we need to understand the entire puzzle and see where our little piece fits, and not try to fit it in the wrong place and frustrate people, in other words. So we look at use cases in a way that is more collaborative with the industry to ensure that the adoption makes sense to the industry and is not a pain to the industry, if you see what I mean. We will also, of course, focus on the vLEI, and that's something I'm going to cover a bit in a second. The verifiable LEI, which is the evolution, or the digital evolution of the legal entity identifier, which is the reason why I was very excited to join GLEIF as the new CEO, because it's a topic that is close to my heart, and the underlying technology that is under the vLEI is very exciting and promising. Here is the vLEI, and then we'll go to our discussion. So the vLEI is it's a distributed or decentralized identity and verifiable credential system. So you might have heard of self-sovereign identity, DID, and VC, verifiable credentials. Well, this is one of them, of those implementation, specifically built for organizations. All the other ones you're hearing about in blockchain conferences or in the digital conferences, they generally build for individual. So identifying someone as an individual or a company as a company, but never both together. And this system enables the signing or verification of a company as a company, or of the people acting on behalf of that company, with a very clear link between that individual acting on behalf of the company and the company itself. To the point that if that individual leaves the company, the credential issued by his former employer can be revoked instantaneously, which is quite important, because today, when you look at digital certificates, for example, or other methods of verification, digital verification of individuals or companies, it's never linked together, meaning that I can still use my digital certificates tomorrow if I get fired by GLEIF and sign on behalf of GLEIF. You will have to double check that am I employed by GLEIF? Am I not employed by GLEIF? Am I all right? Do I still have the right to sign on behalf of GLEIF? Well, with that, it's actually verifiably, digitally a proof that I can still do it or I can't do it anymore. It's global in its application, and it's, of course, secure as it should be. So that explains very well what I mean. It cryptographically binds a person with his role to the organization it's working for. It is based on a trust layer. So the trust system that we built is based on the GLEIF as a root of trust. And it's a good root of trust, because remember, the GLEIF is overseen by regulators from all over the world, meaning that it's a public good. It's not a commercial initiative. So in our view, it is the best root of trust for organization identity in a digital organizational identity. We rely on a network of qualified vLEI issuers, similar to the LEI issuers. It's a network of companies that we qualified as good issuers of vLEIs. These are in charge of verifying that the company asking for a vLEI is effectively the company and not someone else pretending to be that company. So do the KYB if you wish. And also the individuals who wants to receive an official organization role credential, that they are effectively the people they pretend to be, like the CEO, the CFO, so the important authorized signatories, for example. And then the legal entities themselves, and that's why it's called the self-sovereign identity system. Once they have the vLEI package, they can start issuing their own credentials and revoke their own credentials and rotate keys for employees losing their credential access. So really managing the system on their own without having to rely on a third party like a certificate authority and having to pay $10 each time they want to change something. Very autonomous system. And those credentials really can be everything and anything. The power of this thing, of this technology is mind-blowing. So we're using it at GLEIF to sign our annual reports, for example, but the annual report is signed by multiple parties in our case. So we subdivide the annual reports. I sign the entire report. The auditor signs only the financial bit. My chief marketing officer signs the marketing bit. And we ensure that you can have a verifiably signed document that is granular to a level that were not possible in the past, and except if you do it physically on paper. We also have another pilot that is actually successfully concluded this week of EBA, so the European Banking Authority, using it as a authentication mechanism, so a login password for banks into their reporting system. So instead of doing login password, they present their vLEI. EBA recognized that it's BNP Paribas login and not Société Générale. And it's also used as a digital signature on the report sent to EBA, so the Pillar 3 reporting, and where EBA, again, thanks to the credential, can verify that it's the right person at the company signing the report and not the secretary or the janitor or someone that should not be signing that report. So it's quite robust. And in the middle, you have a lot of use cases that we are all exploring, and that's going to be probably the challenge we will have at GLEIF, is selecting the ones that we believe will be the most successful to create that awareness, but also create that usage, and then make it a standard for digital ID and verifiable credential. But some examples, invoice fraud prevention. So if I'm a company and I want to avoid being to receive invoice that are not coming from my suppliers, I issue a credential, give it to the supplier, and I say, I want you to sign all invoices with that credential. Like this, I recognize you are my supplier, not someone's pretending to be my supplier. Telecommunication securing, that's happening in the US as we speak. Telcos using the vLEI system to link phone numbers to companies to ensure that they can block communications coming from fake Amazons or fake Netflix contacting you to supposedly change your credit card detail and then stealing your money. So those type of use cases are being implemented as we speak. So it's quite trade document verification, etc., etc. So let's start with the first question. So we will go through current pain points around identity, the role of identity solutions, the impacts of the LEI and the vLEI, and then some discussions around interoperability of identity protocols. So first question for Pamela. So what are the key identity-related challenges in supply chain and trade finance that you are facing today in cross-border trade or trade digitalization, and how these impact operational efficiency and trust among parties?
Very briefly on the problems. First, a lot of information is not tagged with the right source, counterparty, and so on in relation to the information that's embedded in trade documentation. So if you think of the supply chain, there's 36 key trade documents, which facilitate the flow of good from ordering, manufacturing, conveying, and then the entire payments process. And within within those 36 key trade documents, we've identified around 190 core data elements, all of which need to be shared across the supply chain. And our vision is for those 190 data elements to be standardized so that they can be plug and playable and interoperated across multiple parties, multiple jurisdictions. And a lot of those data elements also need to be tagged with provenance, like where did it come from? Truth, as in, is it a true statement? So something like IoT or sensors or some form of truth-telling that the recipient can automatically know that this is a true piece of data. And also tracing, meaning the data, the flow of the data is visible to the recipient. And actually, we're DSI, the Digital Standards Initiative. We are very, very concerned with interoperability because that's the whole premise of digitalizing global trade and getting the kind of speed, efficiency, resilience benefits. For us, around a quarter of the core data elements are actually counterparty identification, a supplier, buyer, and that's whether it's for the flow of the good or the payment itself. So how do you make this as simple and easy as possible? Because digitalizing trade is supposed to make trade a lot easier so that more players, even SMEs, could navigate it. And for that, for the counterparty identification, whether it's for conveying the good or conveying the payment, actually the LEI is by far the easiest way to execute that. Now, that's about the problem. Now, the solution is there's issues because countries, they feel that they need national ID to have it be controllable and secure, and for them to have visibility. And so we're not, for me, okay, this is personal opinion, we're not going to change the government's mind about needing this control and this visibility because it's all about risk for them, that they can't let the system get out of control. And so I think we need to have a way to use the LEI and the vLEI to actually facilitate the process of interoperability between national business identities. Just like how SWIFT does it for payments. For me, LEI can actually be the interoperability platform for different businesses, no matter where in the supply chain globally they sit, to actually identify the correct counterparty and not have to check all of the data associated with that counterparty. Because why is trade slow today is because of the checking process. Because we need to cut and paste and check. And also that's error prone. It's a lot of human kind of manipulation, intentionally or unintentionally. And so, digitalizing trade is about getting rid of all of that. And so LEI for us is a really essential part. That has been clear. So now the next task is how do we get regional groupings like ASEAN or APEC to really commit to LEI so that their national governments will have confidence that they can use the LEI as a prong in their national identity schemes. So anyways, that's the challenge that you're dealing with every day.
Absolutely. And I think the beauty of the LEI in that, and maybe the message is not passed well enough at this stage, is that it is always anchored into a national identity system. So we do not create LEI without a link to a business registry ID number. So it's always mapped to a national identity level because we're not a legal identity issuer. We are a proxy to national identity that works cross-border. That's the difference. Thank you. Very, very interesting. So on the payment side, Paula, I don't even need to tell your name because you are the securities, payments, trade, and blockchain. Well, so Paula, so in cross-border payments, what are the most significant friction points that hinder seamless transactions, and how does the lack of standardized identity frameworks contribute to this?
Yeah, I quickly checked with our payments experts internally and in the payment group. So might be a little bit disappointing, but the the friction is actually multitude of reasons. It could be, but I believe what you're referring to specifically is an unable to execute, which is a big part of it as well. And when it comes to that, payment is much simpler than actually trade, right? So we basically have a debtor, which is identified by the debtor agent with an account and name. And then we have the creditor, which is very often provided by the debtor itself. So as long as this data is not granular enough, providing the data attributes we would need to process a payment, like the account number and the name, and now very often also the addresses, this actually does cause friction. I confirm that. Would the LEI be of help? Clearly it would. If this, is a legal entity which would come with the addresses, and now with the migration to ISO, we not only enable the LEI as a data attribute in payments to be transferred end to end, right? But actually also what we are demanding is a name and address of the beneficiary or the creditor. Why is this important? Because, in our payment processing, in particular on a cross-border level, we are actually, obliged to do certain due diligence on a transaction, and the LEI, if it would be rolled out globally, and if it would provide the granularity on the legal entity, we are dealing with, and also actually for us, it's not only the legal entity, but also the location of this legal entity, right? Then actually this would be a big value add.
Thank you so much. And we'll continue on that discussion of solution in the future. So Colin, in the security space, so LEI actually started in the capital market space with OTC derivative transaction reporting and other capital markets requirements, MiFID saying, no LEI, no trade type of statement by regulators in Europe, by ESMA. So from the security services perspective, what is the role of identity like LEI? What role does the LEI play in securing and ensuring that securities transaction management is efficient and also potentially mitigating risks?
Thank you. I'm just going to take 2 minutes to talk about ISSA, just in case you're payments people rather than securities people. So ISSA is the International Securities Services Association. We are focused on the front to back value chain of security services. And the reason that's important for this conversation is securities is a highly intermediated business. So we have the customer, who may be an investment manager. They've got multiple funds they control or controls part of the portfolio of. Those funds have multiple custodians. Those custodians have multiple CSDs to interact with. So we have a whole chain of people involved in every transaction. And identifying the people through that is why this is key. So what ISSA does is we try and reduce the risk within that ecosystem. We increase the efficiency, and more importantly, we try and increase the client outcomes and the client satisfaction with what we do. And much of that is to do with how can we adopt standards globally, right? So everybody in this room, if you have a portfolio of securities, you probably have some based in the US, some in your local market, and some probably in some of the emerging markets as well. And that identification of the ownership is a problem for the issuers as well. So if you look at you're an issuer, you're trying to understand who owns your company or who owns your debt, that is absolutely key to good corporate governance. So understanding the LEI and how it flows through is important for us. The thing we're working on at the moment is what we call the unique trade identifier. So at the moment, through that intermediated chain, we're trying to say, actually, we want something to identify the trade. And what I would like to do at the same time is identify the counterpart. So the adoption of the LEI throughout the value chain of securities is, to my mind, extremely important, because come back to the objectives of ISSA, it reduces the risk and it also increases the efficiency and the client outcomes. And that's not just for the clients of the securities value chain, but also those investors and there. And the way I look at this is it's been driven by regulation. Regulation is not the right way to look at it. I was at UBS when Lehman's went bankrupt. We almost went bankrupt ourselves, but that's a different problem. It was a nightmare to find out what trades were executed against which Lehman's entity. But everybody talked about OTC derivatives. The biggest loss we had in UBS when Lehman's went bankrupt was a stop, borrow, loan trade in Italy. All right. And again, we didn't understand which legal entity was party of that. So the understanding of whom the counterpart is, particularly on those collateralized trades, is an imperative. So we're very pro getting that legal entity identifier all the way through the value chain, and we think it is a business case thing, not a regulatory imperative.
And for the UTI, if I'm not wrong, part of the UTI is actually the LEI, right? It's the issuer of the of the reference is identified in the UTI, correct?
Yes, I was trying to simplify it.
Yes, just to say that it's also part of that. Thank you. So what I like about the vLEI, as I mentioned early on, is that it's a protocol play. So it's not specifically built on one blockchain and then it's or one specific tool and that it cannot be used elsewhere. It's portable as a system, and it's all about interoperability at the end. So Sergey, how do decentralized networks and interoperability technologies such as those Chainlink are developing support the concept of verified identity layer to increase trust and interoperability in cross-chain transactions? That's a load of a question.
Yeah, sure. Makes sense. So blockchains as a technology come out of the public blockchain world. That's where all the technology in the enterprise blockchain and capital markets blockchain world come out of. And the history of that technology is that it's anonymous or what's called pseudonymous. So it's inherently initially built as a place without identity. It's basically made to avoid identity. That's one of the features. In this case, it's really not a feature, right? Because as we heard from the other panelists, in order to do all these very important, valuable transactions, checks, final reconciliations, risk management, all these things that the more advanced capital markets and trade finance and other payments and traditional worlds do, you need identity as a key building block. So the blockchain world is kind of an identity anemic environment. There is no identity on purpose almost in how the technology works. That creates a pretty unique clean slate kind of world. And the way that clean slate type of world is trying to get solved is that in each individual chain, you have one or two groups that are trying to make what are known as whitelists. So that's their individual identity scheme against which they can execute transactions. That's what the current state of the industry, basically. That creates an immense amount of fragmentation. And that fragmentation makes it impossible for people to interoperate because you might have your whitelist and who you can transact with, but that whitelist isn't usable by anyone else other than you because you are the only one who knows what that whitelist means. And then if you start trying to create your own whitelist standard in any one blockchain or set of blockchains, it becomes really complicated because as we know, the identity data is super fragmented across countries, across industries, across use cases. And so aggregating that successfully just because you want to put identity on a blockchain as a commercial business is very hard. So that's kind of the impasse or weird current state of the identity market. I think what the vLEI does is create essentially an open global standard. It's in the best position to create this open global standard that can create an identity scheme or essentially a global whitelist across all blockchains. So that's what the vLEI can do, in my opinion, and do it successfully because it's already very widely adopted. It's integrated into other transactional identity standards. And so the question is, how do you apply the vLEI standard into hundreds, thousands, eventually millions of different blockchain environments? So that's the challenge that we kind of work on, where our system generates a lot of data input systems into blockchains. So the way that we approach this problem is we would take the vLEI information and we would make it accessible onto hundreds, thousands, eventually millions of chains by allowing people to query the vLEI system from a blockchain. So instead of having to everyone make their own whitelist or a set of whitelists, you can have a smart contract on the chain of choice, your chain and someone else's chain, And from that smart contract, through the Chainlink system, you can then query, you can request information back into the blockchain about a specific identity. Or someone can submit their identity information into a transaction at any number of blockchains. And so this kind of allows the vLEI to be a layer of identity on top of this pseudonymous, anonymous blockchain world. And that's really pretty important because it's a consistent problem for more valuable, higher volume securities, payments, and trade transactions. So it's a critical building block. And I'm a very big believer in open source myself. So Chainlink is a open source system and big believer in the power of open source and open standards. And I think historically they've done very well, right? Standards that are supported by a community of people. So I think the vLEI has that very big advantage as well. And that's very compatible with the ethos and the approach in the blockchain industry. So I think it's a very compatible approach and technology, and excited to see it become useful.
Yes, and that's a good reminder that effectively the vLEI system is based on an open source SSI and verifiable credential protocol. And I think it's important, as mentioned, because we don't want to lock that system into any specific platform or commercial benefits or interests. It needs to be a public good. That's what I believe so strongly, and that's why I'm trying to work with people like Sergey and others in enabling that system on blockchain and in other industries. So looking at the next question, so that's for Pamela. So as more jurisdictions are moving towards the adoption of MLETRA, and maybe you can explain what this is all about, how could the adoption of LEI or vLEI improve transparency and trust within global supply chain, especially when multiple parties and jurisdictions are involved? I think you already shared part of the answer, but it's an opportunity to explain what this soup of letters means.
So you said MLETR, right?
Yes.
Okay, so the Model Law on Electronic Transferable Records is a legal foundation for the digitalization of global trade today. And the reason that it is that it builds on other model laws which legitimize the use of electronic transactions, including electronic signatures and so on. So when you use DocuSign, when companies digitalize invoices and ordinary trade documents, those are relying on a previous model law. The current model law for electronic transferable records, goes one step further, and it says that even negotiable instruments should be able to be digitalized, i.e., a negotiable instruments like a document of title, something like a promissory note, a bill of lading, where the possession of that instrument, that document, or a physical instrument, gives the bearer some kind of legal right. So you have the bill, you own the bill of lading, and then you own the cargo. You have a promissory note, and it means it's as good as money. So until now, those kind of instruments haven't been, they have to be paper. And if you go into a court of law, the judge might ask you, well, show me the paper. So the model law will help all of those to be digitalized. And that is really important because basically those negotiable instruments are all the key nodes on the supply chain. So for bill of lading, it's the key node in shipping. For promissory note and bill of exchange, those are the key instruments used in payments. All of the other documents, basically the data flow, they all go into these key documents of title. So if you think about a supply chain, like why are so many supply chains still using paper? The answer is that if you can digitalize most of the supply chain, but that at a certain point you have to print everything out, you just won't do it. Okay, because the whole point is to share data. And then if you have to print everything out, well, then it's kind of no point. So we need these documents of title, these negotiable instruments to be digitalized. We're getting there. 37% of global GDP is now aligned, including US, Germany, France, and UK. And then a set of very small countries, which have legalized first, and then now they're working on implementation. Another 26% of global GDP has committed, including China, Japan, South Korea, Thailand, hopefully as of tomorrow, Malaysia. Any country which is in the WTO e-commerce joint statement initiative, including most of Europe, including most of the developed world. There is an implicit commitment in the e-commerce JSI. It's actually vLEIs is named to align to it. Now, whether the e-commerce JSI eventually gets into plurilateral status, that's another question. But these countries basically represent 90% of global trade. So what does this mean for LEI? Is that the key part of the key to enabling the digital supply chain to actually work from a data sharing, data efficiency, and a data aggregation perspective is to know where did the data come from, and to have that be able to be tagged by something which doesn't require additional layers of checking. Now, in the world of payments, you're already used to checking that counterparty identification because the transaction isn't right in front of you. In a trade world, the buyer knows the supplier. He goes there every year. So you think, oh, well, I know my supplier, this is the address and so on. Now, in a world where supply chains are redesigning, where you might have to shift suppliers, where you might have to understand which factory of the supplier is actually supplying the good, and you have to prove that at the border with the border authorities using traceable, auditable methods, you absolutely want a piece of data to guarantee that that identity is actually true. So for me, not only the legal framework is getting into place, but also we have so many geopolitically derived pressures on supply chains to achieve that level of traceability. And there's absolutely no way to do it unless you add a lot of complexity. The simplest way to do it is to get a globally interoperable identity, identification. So maybe something for all of you. Countries in their alignment process to vLEIs, in their digital trade process, they are all coming out with public consultations. So, for example, Australia has a public consultation out now because the STS, the Simplified Trade System, is considering ways to upgrade the Australian legal infrastructure to promote digital trade. Those questions, there are a few which are pertaining to LEI. So if you're a business on the supply chain and you're wanting to facilitate the global adoption of something which would make life easier for everyone, I would really encourage you to look at the consultation and submit. It's just like, there's other consultations going on, but this is the one that's currently live. So anyways, a small pitch for please contribute to Australia's future as a member of the global supply chain.
You can see the passion right at the table. Paula, you want to add something?
Yeah, probably. I totally understand where your pain points are, and in payments business, we would love to support that. But I believe actually, and this is a discussion we had at the PMPG, because there's a huge opportunity LEI brings, but we also need to recognize that actually in the payment business, there's a lot of intermediary business in between where we need to do certain level of checks, right? Our checks go beyond the financial risk, right? They come actually with non-financial risk, which is much more difficult to understand, right? So the LEI does give us a huge opportunity in understanding the counterparty and the legal entity, but we actually are very committed to work with GLEIF to see actually what are the additional data attribute we might actually require for the LEI to bring us that value in addition, right? Mm-hmm. Because, very often as an intermediary, I don't have necessarily the underlying data on the debtor and the creditor. And while, for example, the legal entity identifies a legal entity, for us in payments, it's also very important to understand, where is this operating unit I'm, maintaining the account. So this is something which we cannot underestimate. And what we've done actually when evaluating how mature our community is in adopting the consumption of the LEI, there's a lot of work still to be done, right? So banks actually do appreciate and understand the value of the LEI in a KYC processes when they adopt their clients, right? The legal entity. But actually consuming that data on the flight of a transaction is still something we should need to address. Yep. So you simply, identify, and I appreciate, the verifiable LEI, right? If you're talking about a new technology, absolutely get it in from the beginning. Integrating that in an old infrastructure and technology is still a challenge which we need to acknowledge and work on. Just to add that, it's the potential is clearly there, but there's huge amount of work to be done on the way to it.
I don't have to ask questions anymore. That's cool. Sergey, go ahead.
So we should just put all this on a blockchain, I think. I think if we just put it on a blockchain and we get the vLEI working, we can just make it all be all smooth and
Would love to.
We'd love to. That's it. We're all on the same page. Blockchain it is.
Okay, so we can close the conversation now. I'm going to go to Colin, if you don't mind, and go back maybe on the fraud if we have time afterwards. So on the interoperability across networks. So given the fragmented nature of global financial markets, how do you see identity solution like LEI facilitating interoperability across different networks, platforms, or even regulatory frameworks? Because we know that's a challenge in capital market, is fragmentation of everything at the end of the day.
Yeah, and that's the case. But I'm not going to answer this question because I think between Pamela and Paula, they've summed up the same problems, right? So the interesting thing is you've picked 4 people from 4 different sort of sectors of the financial market. The problems are the same. So I'm going to be quiet and we can get back to fraud. So sorry.
Okay, no problem. So, so interoperability is important, and international standards in general are important. UTIs, ISINs, for example, and other identifiers, and LEI is one of them. So I'll go to, if I manage to have access to Sergey. So what are the technical or governance challenges in enabling interoperability between different blockchains? So the governance in particular. And how could identity solutions like vLEI play a role in overcoming those technical and governance challenges?
Yeah, so the governance challenges often come down to certain legal requirements and meeting legal requirements. And I don't think the legal requirements in the traditional markets we're talking about are going away. They're all going to need to be made very compatible with the identity system and the transactional system and the record keeping system, which in my world is the blockchain systems. So it's the governance question, I think, will boil down to what is legal, what is not legal, what is accepted in the cases of identity, payments, record keeping, presenting information that has legally binding consequences. That is what governance will end up boiling down to, in my opinion. And the challenge is getting all of that to be compatible with blockchains. Which really isn't that complicated. It'll just have to be like, and we accept a blockchain record, and we accept a smart contract as an authoritative proof of ownership or an authoritative proof of transactional completion. That I don't think that'll be that complicated. It'll take time because the legal systems generally evolve pretty slowly. But once there's enough demand, they evolve much quicker. So I think it's fine. The technical challenges really boil down to a lot of the fragmentation of blockchains in the blockchain world, and that fragmentation is only increasing for a very simple reason. Well, 2 simple reasons. The first reason is that the cost of generating your own chain or entering a chain is just going down. So if 5 years ago it was very costly to build your own blockchain and make your own private chain, or it was very costly to enter another blockchain ecosystem, now it's becoming extremely low cost, right? Like the database industry was very costly to deal with in the 1970s. Like making a database was a really big deal and took millions of dollars, was a big deal. Now, teenager can spin up a database in 5 lines of code in a couple of minutes, and it's a very high quality database for free. That's what it's going to be like to make your own blockchain or integrate into blockchains or deal with blockchains. So that's going to make that more prevalent, but that's also going to generate more fragmentation. So the fundamental problem is synchronizing identity information and synchronizing what an identity is doing or not doing in regards to different transactions across different chains. That synchronization of, is this identity the same identity as that identity on the other chain? What is this identity involved in on this chain? And what is it involved in on that chain? It's basically a data reconciliation problem in a very fragmented technical landscape, which at a very fundamental level is solved through something called CCIP, the cross-chain interoperability protocol, which functions similarly to TCP/IP. TCP/IP is what unifies the internet from a collection of different databases and routing infrastructures into a single internet. So CCIP is our proposed solution to that, and it's getting widely adopted in the capital markets. And so you just solve the fragmentation by interconnecting everything and making synchronization a low-cost, efficient, seamless problem, right? It's just, if an identity is over here, then we know it's also over there. If an identity is involved in something over there, we also know it's doing something over here. And that's really just a technical problem that has to do with efficiency, scalability, and having a single protocol, which is essentially what we work on.
Exciting stuff. So last little point before conclusion. So going back to Paula on the fraud side of things. So that was a question on fraud, but I think it can be talked to all people on the panel. So one of the use case for using LEI, especially vLEI, is prevention of fraud. The impersonation of companies, impersonation of people working for companies, invoice fraud, all those challenges that have exploded with digital platforms and the use of internet for everything at the end of the day. So how can this problem be solved with the use of standards in general, and maybe the vLEI and the LEI in that case, and specifically for payments?
Yeah, I recognize the potential of the vLEI, right? But again, it comes down to the infrastructure of the banks being able to verify that. And this is actually, the potential is clearly there. If you would have that, this would eliminate a number of fraud cases. In particular, in Europe, what we call actually right now, I faced it last week with one of the clients, they call it a car dealership CEO fraud. I didn't even know what it was, but actually it is indeed someone walking into the bank and pretending they are the CEO of the used car dealer and they, kind of initiating fraud transaction. This would absolutely help, but it needs maturity of the market, of the infrastructure of the bank. So, I recognize the potential of the blockchain. We moved away from faxes, right? We do now SWIFT payments, but it takes time. So,
question of time and time, yeah.
Exactly.
And it's understandable. At the same time, I used to work for banks, as you know, and we were still using COBOL-based systems. And you're like, maybe it's time for change as well at some. But I understand it's a challenge. It's costly and it's risky.
But can I just come back to my original point? It's about the business case.
Yes.
And the amount of fraud which is happening in payments has to make the banks think about how they're doing things differently. Mm-hmm. And that's where we come. None of this should be driven by the regulators. It should be driven by the fact this is what we need to do to make the industry more efficient. And I think the payments banks have got to get onto it quicker than they are now. I know I work for a big bank, X used to. I know it's slow, etc., but it is a imperative. And if you can get something like the verified legal identifier through your systems, you've changed the fraud outcomes dramatically.
We will, as soon as vLEI is out there, show me the number of entities which have it, right? So as soon as it is a business case and a potential to resolve, of course, this is the first thing banks would do, right?
So if this is where it comes back to the business case. So if you want to bank with me, you have to use the verified LEI. And that stops the problem. And it becomes that everybody who's working with you uses the same identifier, and then you get to the proper business case. But agreed, it's a chicken and egg adoption thing, but we in the industry need to force people to adopt for our own business cases rather than regulatory driven.
Yes.
Well, there's always going to be regulation.
Absolutely. And some validation agents are banks, for example, who are leveraging their onboarding process to issue LEIs to corporates who don't have an LEI, are close to say no LEI, no business with me, because it does help them in their day-to-day reconciliation operations, etc. And I'm hoping that it will be the case for vLEI in the future, but it needs to establish itself as a global protocol. We know that, and we're working towards that. As a conclusion, maybe it's a call for action, really, that I would like you to think about. So what does the industry needs to do? Maybe regulators as well. because you know how it works. If the industry doesn't move based on business case, the regulators afterwards will say, well, you're not moving, so I'm imposing it now. And that's the threat that is over us. So what's the call for action based on our discussion today in your various industries? Maybe starting with you, Sergey.
In the blockchain world and the DeFi world and the digital asset TradFi world, I think it's more transaction value that's possible because you can prove certain qualities of identity. So I think it's basically complying with the requirements of counterparties that require identity to do transactions with you. And I think the vLEI can be a good resource to enable that compliance, because the threshold for DeFi or the threshold for crypto from a compliance point of view is low. It doesn't require a lot of compliance to participate in DeFi or in Bitcoin or crypto transactions. But the threshold for compliance to participate in digital asset transactions in traditional markets is much higher. And so I think the driving force will be that there's more value in those transactions that's going on chain. And then one of the requirements for that value to be used in a transaction or to be interacting with your assets will be proving identity as a requirement. And then I think the vLEI can emerge as the efficient, secure way to do that in a way that allows the transaction to happen. So I think that'll be the large driving force from the blockchain point of view.
Thank you.
So I would like to say that that I see rapid adoption of the LEI in the goods supply chain. But I actually think we have so many hurdles. Like here in this room, we speak as if we know that digitalization is going to solve the key problems in our universe. Except that the questions I get from supply chain operators, they're very, very different, right? It's everything from if we use digital identity, will my identity be compromised? Cybersecurity, scams. For government perspective, there are some people in government who don't want more transparency, okay? Because there's a lot of money from being made by people from lack of transparency. So, I mean, and I'm honest, the questions that we get they're just very, very basic. So actually, I think if we could get LEI as the cornerstone of the payments world, that would at least get the people who are dealing primarily with the goods supply chain and the physical movement, it would enable them to understand that this actually serves a really essential function and has successfully enabled faster and more transparent payments, which are to the good of everybody. And we use that case study to then take the LEI into the physical supply chain. Because if we try to answer all of these really very basic kind of so-called dumb questions, dumb only because they're so simple that we think, wow, are we really answering this? But if we try to address all of those, I think the level of understanding of how digital trade will really work is still too low. So we need a business case, and I think the best business case we have now is actually in the payments world. We just need to make that kind of comprehensible to people whose life is in the goods trade world.
And it's a requirement. Well, it is a part of the agenda of G20 and the FSB, so we'll get there.
Yeah. And this would be actually my conclusion as well. So I think we need to join forces, right, to make sure that the adoption of the LEIs is taken up, starting at the point of KYC and becomes a natural data attribute, which is going to be transferred with the payment. Mm-hmm. And in addition to that, we need to work actually as a community, as an industry in a payment space together with GLEIF to understand on the roadmap, develop a path towards a 100% adoption. Because remember, we have 330 million legal entities out there. So we are at the very, very beginning. We need to make sure that actually the LEI delivers on the promises in payments as well, which basically means that actually we have all the data attributes to do the non-financial risk assessment on the flight of a payment as well, because we don't want to create a friction in between, right?
And Colin, and we will be finishing up with you.
One of the unnamed things about Swift is it actually has more securities messages on it than payments. And this is a fact. And many of those messages are generating free of payment movements. And so I think actually the three of us should join forces to make that a imperative and show that there is a real business case for getting the LEI more widely adopted.
So that's a very excellent conclusion for this discussion. So ISSA, PMPG, and ICC and the blockchain world working together to improve identity management overall across industries. And I think that's what we wanted to do with this discussion. Is often those industries don't talk to one another because you have so much to do within your industry that it's complicated to work with on others' problems. And I think if there is an opportunity through industry associations like yours to make that happen, actually. So thank you so much for your attention. We don't have time for questions, but I'm sure the speakers will be around for a few minutes unless they are very busy, as I'm sure they are. But thank you so much for attending, and I hope it was useful and enlightening. Thank you.